Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to be talking about Brainiac from DC, Morgan Le Fay from Marvel. We're even going to be talking about some Robotech, which is classic anime. But before we get into all that, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all that, let's dive in. The prologue to this one takes place on Y2K. And guys my age are very familiar with what Y2K was. But I've noticed that a lot of listeners that are a little younger maybe weren't born yet when Y2K came and went. And for instance, with my son, I've had to explain it to some of his friends who've been over to the house and played with us a couple times. So for those guys who are unfamiliar, I'm going to try to really speed through this as best as I can. And mind you, I'm kind of computer illiterate, so I'm probably the worst person in the world to try to explain this. But the way it was explained to me is that the way a computer used to keep track of the date was with a 6-digit number, and we don't do that anymore. But it used to just be the last 2 digits of the year, and then the next 2 digits represented the month, and then the next 2 digits represented the day. So if we're talking about New Year's Eve 1999, a computer would see that date as 991231. And up until that date, that was fine, right? Because the whole time computers had been around, that was never an issue. But a computer engineer at some point noticed that when you would change that date to January 1st of the year 2000, which the computer would see as 000101, right? That was messing up some computers when they would do it to kind of experiment with them, right? And my understanding, again, maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I was told, is that inside the computer somewhere is a registry that keeps track of kind of like what date you installed a program. So if you changed the clock like that on those old computers, the programs would no longer work. And so then the fear that started to spread was, wait a minute, what about all the computers that run like, say, a nuclear power plant? What happens when that fails, right? So I don't want to go so far as to call it hysteria, but at the time, there was so much talk about impending Y2K. And there were a lot of people who genuinely thought that it was going to be the end of the world, right? They thought it was the apocalypse. So Marvel Comics wanted to cash in on that, and they decided to use their character Apocalypse. And they had this story called the 12, and it was kind of like an end of days kind of a thing, right? Over at DC, though, DC was like, well, hold up, this is computer oriented, so we should use a computer character of some sort. And they thought of Brainiac. And I guess DC thought that your garden variety Brainiac was too mundane for such a big moment as the change from one century to the next. And since time obviously played a part, the end of one millennium, the beginning of a new one, they decided to make it be a time travel story. Essentially, what they ran was Terminator, really. They had a robot from the future, which in this case was called Brainiac 13. And he was at the time depicted as the ultimate Brainiac. He comes back to December 31st, 1999, right before the stroke of midnight, because he thinks that's when the world will be the most vulnerable and easy to take over. And so the clock strikes 12, and sure enough, there's a blackout in the comics, which is what a lot of people thought was going to happen in real life. And so Superman gets involved, and the whole thing is a long story. I'll let you guys check it out if you really want a deep dive into the Brainiac Y2K thing. That's not really what I was wanting to do here. I just wanted to set up sort of the bare minimum because it does pertain to this newest adventure. But the big takeaway is that, as I understand it, and by the way, I reread this before I made this video, and I actually think that it's a little ambiguous what exactly happens. Multiple points in that story were, in my opinion, not very well defined. But the way it reads to me is that Brainiac, sometime after sundown, but before sunrise the next morning, he had managed to assimilate the entire Earth with microscopic robots called nanites. And the way it reads to me is that the nanites, which some science fiction authors would refer to as gray goo, the idea would be that they would latch on to non-living matter and consume it and replace it. You know, it's almost like the microscopic machine version of body snatchers. So the idea is if it, say, it eats your car, it then will assume the shape of a car to take the place of the old one. And it's building new machines by breaking down the molecules that had been there before, right? Hopefully that makes sense. As always, if I say something that doesn't make sense to you, feel free to reach out. I will try to do a better job of explaining it. But so it assumes the shape of a car, but the catch is it doesn't look like the old car. It is a upgraded futuristic version. So maybe this one is like a flying car, something like that. But you get the basic gist, right? It's Brainiac was going to upgrade the entire Earth from what had been to this sort of bigger, better, cooler version of everything. And not just machines. It didn't have to be a machine that did something. Even if you just had a plain brick building that did nothing, right? The nanites would still eat the brick and then replace it. And you'd get a futuristic building where your old building had been. And so the way it reads to me is that Brainiac 13 managed to do this on a global scale in less than a night. And then, I don't want to get super into it. Superman was trying to dial that back. He wanted to undo what Brainiac had done, right? But by the time the sun comes up, Metropolis is still futuristic. And by the way, that was kind of a riff on the phrase the man of tomorrow. They wanted him to live in the city of tomorrow. I think the other thing was Superman was seen in some circles as old fashioned and corny and kind of a fuddy duddy. And they were trying to make him seem kind of like cool and hip and new. And you know what I mean? But I really liked the high tech city. I kind of wish they would have stuck with that. But at any rate, the gist in the story itself is that the reason Metropolis stayed that way was because Lex Luthor literally sold his own baby daughter in exchange for the patent rights. So in the computers at LexCorp, all of the blueprints and schematics and formulas and stuff for how all this stuff is made now belong to Lex Luthor. So Lex essentially owned the future, right? But of course, at what cost? He gave up his only daughter for this to happen. And Superman swung by to kind of, throw that in his face, honestly, and be like, what have you done? Like, what is wrong with you? And if I remember correctly, Lex actually says, like, I can make another. I'm not worried about it, you know. Um, so that's pretty messed up. That's pretty twisted. Brainiac 13 then takes Lena Luthor and ages her. She's aged up to adulthood. It turns her skin green and it changes her brunette hair into blonde hair. So she essentially looks like a female version of Brainiac 5 from the Legion of Superheroes. And so then she shows up, she and Brainiac 13, which, by the way, I never fully knew why he needed her exactly, right? And this is just me, but the way it seemed to me was I thought, partially because the green skin, I think, I got the vibe because the guys doing the Superman comics back then were really, really into pop culture references. I kind of thought they were pulling a Frankenstein thing where she was kind of supposed to be like, instead of the bride of Frankenstein, I thought she was supposed to be like the bride of Brainiac. I feel like I even saw something. That's when I owned my comic book store. It might have been a solicitation or something that came out at the time, but I feel like I saw in print where they were calling her the bride of Brainiac. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It's been a while, right? But so these two characters show up then on 9/11. Interestingly enough, I got to be careful kind of how I talk about this. So DC could not possibly have known what was going to happen, right? The comics, by the way, that came out that week, they dropped on 9/12. I remember 9/11 very, very well. I was at my comic shop that day. A bunch of people showed up and kind of huddled together because it was a different world back then. And if you liked comic books and role-playing games and stuff like that, you were kind of an outcast of society, at least where I lived. So the other guys at the comic shop, that was kind of like your family in a way, right? They were the people that accepted you and stuff like that. And so, yeah, like everybody came to the store that day. Nobody bought a single thing, but like everybody was there. And then the next day when the comics dropped, it had affected what people were buying. So that was the first issue of the Devil's Due G.I. Joe comic, for instance. That sold like hotcakes. Because if you think about G.I. Joe's mission statement, it could not have fit the moment any better, right? Well, I'm off topic. The point is, one of the comics that came out around that time was DC was doing this thing called Our Worlds at War. And the big bad guy for that was called Imperiex. And he was more or less DC's answer to Galactus. And DC was kind of weirdly doing this homage to some of their Golden Age comics, where, in World War II, you had the Allied forces, right? So you had countries like America and England and stuff like that. And then they were at war with the Axis powers, which were countries like Germany and Japan and, so on and so forth. Well, so DC was trying to do that kind of, but with planets. And so, of course, Imperiex was the big bad guy. A lot of the other planets were all banding together to try to fight him. So, like Starfire was the representative of Tamaran, and Maxima was the representative of Almerac. And to an extent, Lex Luthor represented Earth in a lot of that stuff, right? And they were going to war with Imperiex. But one of the characters that figured into that story, and again, I don't want to get too deep into that story because that's not what we're talking about today exactly. But two of the characters that show up in that story then are Brainiac 13 and the adult Lena Luthor, right? And if I remember correctly, they were living on War World, which is this mechanical planet. It kind of reminds me of Cybertron from Transformers, the home of, Optimus Prime, where it's an all metal planet. I remember some sort of dialogue where Brainiac 13 was basically using this entire planet as a giant computer to run software that he, had some interest in. But he was offering to help with the Imperiex situation. And then Lena, who again is the green, Brainiac version of Lena Luthor, she was supposed to be loyal to Brainiac 13 kind of exclusively. But she was going behind his back in that story to talk to her father, Lex Luthor, right? So I thought that was very interesting. And we had a big conversation during this game session, by the way, about what was her true motivation. Was it love of humanity where she was going against Brainiac? Was it just she loved her dad and that's why she was helping Lex? Or did she have her own motivation of some sort and we just never got to see enough of her to know what that would be, right? But at any rate, that all that stuff came out in, like I said, the Y2K story was around the year 2000. Our Worlds at War was happening when 9/11 happened, and there's a big moment that, if I remember correctly, DC recalled the issue actually because Lex Luthor had these twin towers, and it turned out they were an anime style gun, kind of like in Robotech, the SDF-1, which is their main ship in the original Macross series. They had this thing called the main gun, and you'd fire that up, and it would just obliterate whatever was in its path, right? Or another way we could frame that is think of the Death Star and the gun that it has, right? So basically, these two buildings kind of served as like the barrel for this kind of Death Star level thing that Lex Luthor had built. And so when an enemy is overhead, like Imperiex, they fire this thing, but it was the first time they'd ever fired it, of course, because you can't exactly fire a Death Star gun and not have the whole world notice that you did it, right? So they fire the thing, but it destroys the two towers that were like its barrel. You see what I'm saying there? And I can't remember if that issue dropped on September 12th or what, but like it was close enough to 9/11 that people freaked out when they saw that on the page. And DC had to like issue an apology and so on and so forth, right? So that's kind of how I remember when Our Worlds at War took place. Okay, so all of that was kind of just a primer so that everybody that listens to the podcast has at least some loose understanding of some of these characters, some of the stuff that's going on, that kind of thing. Because I feel like most of the stuff I just talked about has not really had lasting power. It's not the sort of thing that most people are super aware of, right? So we get into the main plot of this game session, and the three people that were playing were my wife, our son, and our friend Brad. And Brad played the Black Knight from Marvel. And Marvel's had multiple Black Knights. This is the Dane Whitman version. Um, his uncle was the Black Knight in, I want to say, the Silver Age, and he was actually a villain. And then when he died, his equipment and moniker got passed on to Dane, who turned around and used it for good. He became a hero. Um, he joined the Avengers, stuff like that. But he and his uncle shared a common ancestor that was the original Black Knight, and he was actually a member of King Arthur's Round Table. Um, so that was his connection to the Arthurian stuff. That's why Brad was playing the Black Knight. Well, so then my son was playing a DC character named Shining Knight. And Shining Knight was also a member of King Arthur's Round Table back in the days of Camelot, right? And his thing is a fish out of water story where he finds himself in World War II at one point. he becomes a hero. He is fighting the Axis powers, yada yada yada, right? That's Shining Knight in a nutshell. Well, so then we go to my wife, and I, I'm kind of OCD. So if one person's playing a Marvel character and the other person's playing a DC character, I'm always like, hey, can you play someone from like an indie comic or something like that? So that we have like that balance, or the those two things that are normally separate universes. Can we do it that way? And I pitched various characters to her. I'm like, you could be medieval Spawn. I'm not a huge Spawn fan, but I did kind of like medieval Spawn. Because if I remember correctly, it wasn't really his fault. Um, at any rate, she wasn't into that. I brought up Lady Death, who, uh, depending, she's had a million origins over the years because she keeps getting sold from company to company, and they keep, redoing stuff. But usually it has something to do with the Middle Ages, and like we could do a whole thing with that. She didn't want to do that, so she finally settled on Morgan Le Fay because Morgan Le Fay has been done at both Marvel and DC, right? And so it kind of brought up this thing of like, well, which Morgan Le Fay is it? And the route we decided to go is in, um, well, how do I want to put this? Arthurian mythology has been around forever, right? It goes back as far as the Roman Empire, but a lot of it is actually Welsh. And in Wales, for instance, Guinevere was one of four identical quadruplets. So there are four girls that all look exactly the same, and they're all named Guinevere, but they all have a different alignment. So one of them's like lawful good, one of them's like chaotic good, one of them's chaotic evil, right? And then the different Guineveres figure into um different parts of Arthurian mythology then. Well, likewise, there were multiple Morgan Le Fays in the Welsh version of things. And that actually stays through other versions then. So one version, sometimes they're all called Morgan Le Fay. In other versions, sometimes one will be called Morgan. Maybe one of them will be called Morgana. One of them will be Morgaine. One will be Morga Wise. By the way, if you ever hear one referred to as Morga Wise, it's a pretty safe bet. She's like super evil. That's usually the most evil one of the sisters. A lot of people in the modern day, they think of Morgan Le Fay as the mother of Mordred, who is the guy who kills King Arthur, right? But in a lot of the actual Arthurian legend itself, it was Morgawise that was the mother of Mordred, right? And it's also worth pointing out that when King Arthur dies and people are taking him away to an island where he's going to heal or sleep for a long time and come back, and oftentimes the pallbearers at his funeral are Morgan Le Fay and her sisters, so that at that point they're considered heroes, right? And so the actual mythology itself is kind of all over the place in terms of what should Morgan Le Fay's alignment be? Is she good or bad, right? And then, so if you look at comics, especially DC comics, by the way, they can't really decide if they want her to be good or bad. There have been stories where she's been one or the other. In some stories, she's a villain. I've seen her mess with Wonder Woman as a, doing what you would expect villains to do. At other times, though, like in JLU, for instance, when Mordred is being a problem, Morgan Le Fay goes to the Justice League, essentially apologizes for her son, and then helps the Justice League, right? And that's in some old Bronze Age comics too. Over at Marvel, we get more of a villainous Morgan Le Fay. And I feel like that's pretty consistent. I've seen a couple moments where with the Marvel Morgan where she'll be talking to like Doctor Doom or somebody like that, and she seems kind of good by comparison. Those are pretty few and far between, right? At any rate, it caused this big conversation in our game, though. How do we handle this? Usually, obviously, with a character like Superman, DC is the only one telling stories about him. So we only have one thing we have to kind of keep in mind with when we're doing our Superman. Or if it's like Spider-Man, obviously that's only Marvel doing it. So again, we have a clearer idea of how he should act. But then we got to Morgan Le Fay, who's in all of these different things, treated completely different, and all of these things. We're like, how do we reconcile this? So we said, you know what? Let's kind of take advantage of the fact that there's multiple people all basically named Morgan Le Fay, that they're sisters. And so that's how we handled it. Was we said, like, the DC version exists, she's one of four sisters. The Marvel version exists, she's one of four sisters. And by the way, actually, if you look at them, neither Marvel nor DC spells them the same way. You know what I mean? So I thought that was kind of interesting, and that's actually very Welsh of them to do that. But so then we said that the one my wife was playing was actually neither Marvel nor DC. Um, and so she's playing her in the adventure, however you want to word it. What I did was I thought that I had been sort of looking at the problems of our game world, and I was the one kind of saying, okay, we've got people looting businesses. That needs dealt with. Let's have an adventure where we just deal with looters. And then we did that with the Flash family. And then there was a thing where I was like, okay, well, there's buildings are destroyed and there's rubble, and we need to deal with that. And so that was a Green Lantern adventure. But in both of those instances, I was kind of the one, for the most part, that was saying, here's the problem we're focusing on this week. With the Flash thing, my son was actually the one that's like, that sounds like a job for the Flash. And with the Rebel, he's like, that sounds like a job for Green Lantern. So it's not like the players didn't have input, but I was still leading, right? Kind of like, to use a dancing metaphor there. Well, so as a GM, you got to read the room. It's not just about what the characters are like saying they're doing or whatever in the game. Some of it is like keeping an eye on the body language of the players and stuff like that to see if they seem frustrated or bored or whatever, right? And so the vibe I was getting from everybody in the previous game session was that they wanted a little more say in things. So in this game, I gave it to them. I said, hey, I'm just turning it over to you. You lead. You guys deal with whatever you think needs dealt with, deal with it however you want to deal with it, and I will react to you, right? And so the irony is I kind of picked the wrong week to do it. I had decided, because when it comes to coming up with a game, you don't know what mood they're gonna be like when they show up on your front door. You know what I mean? Um, Brad, who was playing the Black Knight, where he's working right now, they have this seasonal event coming up, so he's had to like work every weekend. They're kind of running him into the ground, so on and so forth. So he was like really, really tired and not really wanting a game where he was leading. I think he wanted something easier that week, like just some hack and slash. You know what I mean? Just an old fashioned beat 'em up. So he was being really quiet. My son, it's a long story. He had stayed up the night before. He had to write this big thing. And so he hadn't really gotten a lot of sleep. So then he was dead tired and he wasn't like in the right mindset for what I was wanting to do. And then my wife, ironically, um, we didn't know it when the game began, but this is the game session where she had a mini stroke. And I mentioned that a little while ago on the channel. I posted when it happened, and by the way, a lot of people reached out. We are very appreciative for all the positive comments that we got from you guys. But this is actually the game session that where that happened. And she's better now, right? She's back to how she was before. Um, but at any rate, so she wasn't exactly in the mindset to be doing this either. You know what I mean? And so she was the one though that came up with the thing. They're talking about what to do. They're like, what's the problem? Blah 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 blah. And she was like, well, hey, hold on a minute. In the recent Superman game that we ran, Superman and Batman went to the negative universe where they fought Ultraman and Owlman, who were their counterparts, right? And the heroes won, and they stole the Phantom Zone projector that Ultraman owned. And they brought it back to our universe and they opened it up and they released the heroic version of Brainiac 13, right? And so he's still in our game world. He's in our normal universe. He's in the normal Earth K dimension. So the players talk about what if we had him do what his evil counterpart did on Y2K, where he assimilated the world, right? But instead of it being a bad thing, if the other guy does it, it would be a good thing, right? But then my son brought up Ultra Girl, who is their universe's version of Kara Zor-El. And she's actually not evil. Ultra Girl is actually good, partially because her cousin, right, that world's Kal-El, is really abusive and really mean to her and so on and so forth. And so that has shaped her personality, is him abusing her all the time. So, but the thing is, this spawns this conversation of, well, hold on, are we sure that the other Brainiac 13 can be trusted? Or is he bad? Right? And they didn't know where they stood. And so they're like, okay, well, what else could we do? And so they start talking about Lena Luthor and how she was helping humanity and stuff like that. Maybe she could help. But again, they weren't sure what her motivation really was. And I kind of talked about that earlier, right? So they hated to do that. And then we said in our game that Lena actually had a kid and that the father was Brainiac 13. And so, and by the way, that might not have been the classic way one would go about making a baby. I figure if it's Brainiac 13, it was probably more of a, isolating DNA in a lab and giving her an injection in a syringe, you know what I mean, to the lower abdomen. I doubt it was romance, is kind of where I'm going with it. But nonetheless, she had this kid in our game that does not exist in the comics. Um, and so we were talking about how the kid was basically the spitting image of the mom, maybe some cloning going on there. And then the kid was called Brainiac 14. And so we're like, well, what about Brainiac 14? Is she good or bad? And again, they didn't know where they stood. So they're going back and forth with like this plan because the idea is they're like, if we get a Brainiac to assimilate the world, then those nanites can fix a bunch of this stuff that's broken, right? So like we were talking in previous adventures, how the Shaper of Worlds did stuff like delete a sewer pipe. Well, the idea then is that the nanites could rebuild this stuff. And my wife was talking about, if there's not enough matter, if some of the matter is missing, we could turn the nanites loose on things like a landfill, convert all that crap that people have thrown away, turn that into usable material that could be sewer pipes or whatever you need, right? So like they really liked the idea that the Brainiac assimilation thing was the key. They were just hung up on the alignment of the various Brainiac characters. They kind of had three of them now to choose from. but they didn't know if any of them were really good. They didn't know if they could trust them. And then there was kind of a another layer to that, which is what is the alignment of the nanites themselves? Even if you had a good Brainiac, like let's say for the sake of argument that Brainiac 14 was good, is she using nanites that she herself built? Do we know that the nanites are good, or is there something else going on there? Like, for instance, would the nanites just be something in a lab that the original evil Earth K Brainiac 13 made and made them to be evil? There were so many parts of this plan that could blow up in the face of the heroes. And again, my wife, as we're playing, nobody noticed because everybody was like dead tired that day and so on and so forth. So as she's starting to have like stroke symptoms, none of us are picking up on it. And she had said a couple things that kind of didn't make sense. And we were just like, what? Like, what do you mean? Um, but so my wife starts looking at this wiki online because the stats that Marvel gave Morgan Le Fay, and she was trying to use kind of like cherry pick between Marvel and DC stuff for it. And by the way, if I remember correctly, because we played this like a month ago now, um, I don't think we found stats for Morgan Le Fay in DC, if I remember correctly. Um, if anybody out there knows where that's at, we looked in all the usual places and we didn't see it at all. Um, but at any rate, so we couldn't find stats for that. We were using the stats from the old Marvel Superheroes game by TSR. And even those seemed kind of lacking. So then my wife was online looking at stuff listed on like an official Marvel wiki. And they said, and then they would, of course, cite what issue this power was used in too. But they said that the Marvel Morgan Le Fay um, had this power called omnipresence. She had a couple powers that were relevant. One was kind of like personality transfer, one was omnipresence. So the gist though was then, first of all, Morgan Le Fay can be in more than one place at once. And then she can also choose if she wants to appear as a solid being or something more kind of like a ghost in a way, right? And she can do this as many times as she wants. And then the ghost selves can basically possess a target. So my wife comes up with the idea of I'll just possess all the nanites. And then we know what they're doing, basically, right? Because everything is Morgan Le Fay then at that point. And the other thing she did was to make it happen, she possessed Brainiac 14. And that was this moment in the game where I said to her, I'm like, well, you don't know if she's good or bad. I'm like, so if you are doing this to a villain, that's one thing, right? But if you're doing this to a heroic character, think about what you're doing here. And my wife, this is sort of the statement that she made that we realized something was wrong. And I'm trying to remember how she worded it now, but it was something like, um, yes, I'm going to do it against her will. Like I'm going to possess her against her will or whatever, but I'm going to make sure I have her consent. And we were like, what? And like my wife said it a couple times, and then I noticed like when she was moving like she would shut her eyes when she was talking, and her eyes were moving like really slow. And she was saying it really slow, like she was having to like really focus to think straight. And I was like, "Oh my God, are you having a stroke right now?" And she was like, "Probably." And I was like, "Game's over." Obviously, right? Because that's the priority. So we suddenly ended the game. and I took her to the nearest town, um, to the hospital. And unfortunately, when she has a mini stroke, they can't really do anything for her. The reason we take her to the hospital is if it snowballs and if it turns into a big stroke, you want her to be there, right? Because then they have the tools they need to kind of minimize that damage if that's what ends up happening. So that was the end of this game session. Again, that was about a month ago. She's totally recovered since then. Um, I talked about it before, and I had somebody, I can't remember now how they worded it, but their concern was they're like, "Oh my God, dude, like your wife's having a stroke and you're over here talking about gaming." Um, my wife is obviously the priority. I drop everything when it comes to the game and I focus on her, right? It's just that when I'm talking to you guys about stuff, I feel like this is a gaming channel. You know what I mean? And so therefore it's going to kind of get framed a certain way when I'm talking about it. I'm not trying to misrepresent it though. I don't want anybody to think that, I don't think I mishandled the situation. My wife doesn't think I did anything wrong. Um, but yeah. So then this thing that I'm telling you about just kind of comes to an abrupt end. I would tell you what happens next because then, we played after she recovered. We picked up where we left off here. We did more. Um, but this has already been a super long video. So I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank you guys for being here. As always, if you're willing to support the channel, we would love it if you hit the like button. Um, make sure you're subscribed because YouTube really does love to unsubscribe you and not tell you about it. Every week, I have somebody tell me that that happened to them. And last but not least, feel free to leave a comment. Um, that does help out the channel, but we really do like hearing from you guys. Um, and that's it. That's it for this one. From all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.